Mancini. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the changes in the content management marketplace and how that translates into increased value and a reconfigured industry moving forward. So what I'd like to do is start with the context, then I'd like to talk about three elements of being extreme, if you will. The first is the nature of how the buyers are changing, the second is how governance is changing, and the third is what extreme engagement ultimately means and how that translates into a redefined industry moving forward. So we got the context, we got the buyers, governance, and engagement, and then a redefined industry. So let's start with the context. We call this inside AIIM the two-humped industry, and it doesn't really look like this. It looks a little bit more like this. And this diagram is from Geoffrey Moore from Escape Velocity, and it basically talks about what Jeff sees as the business architecture in any business ecosystem. And if you look at the chart, what you see along the x-axis is the number of customers. What you see on the y-axis is effectiveness. And Jeff's contention is that there are really two sweet spots in any business ecosystem. One is a complex systems sweet spot, and the second is a volume operations sweet spot. And so what we've had as an industry over the course of the last 15 years is we really were centered on the complex systems side. Now a lot of things happened to change that over the course of the 2000s. We introduced SharePoint into the marketplace. That took that complex system sweet spot and pushed it to the right. We had the entrance of enterprise IT players like Salesforce that brought SaaS applications to the enterprise space. And on the consumer side, we all of a sudden started to see the entrance of document-ish or content-ish players on the consumer side. And so you had players like Dropbox and Box.net and Evernote and Yammer and Google Docs. And so what you have is a very different industry than what we had as recently as 5 years ago. You still have the complex systems side, and the complex systems side looks at what's going on the volume side and tries to bring some of those lessons into their business models. And then you have a consumer-based model that's moving into the small enterprise space that is trying to move from an advertising-based model to try and recoup some of the margins associated with the enterprise space. Very different spaces, very different levels of complexity. One's not good and one's not bad. They are just different. And I think it reflects the changes that are going on in the industry and some of the challenges users have to figure out exactly what it is they're trying to do and why it is they're trying to do it, and not confuse one set of solutions with another. So I think as you think about this, the way that people are encountering this on both the end user side as well as on the vendor side is this little Bob Dylan quote, is that people are realizing that they've got to start swimming or they'll sink like a stone because the times they are changing. And I won't sing this, I promise. So that's the context. So the way that translates out there, I think, into elements of extremism, if you will, which is the theme of the AIIM conference, is first of all in terms of the nature of buyers. And let me start there. So let me go buyers, governance, engagement, start with buyers. So in terms of buyers, I think what we see is a buyer migration in motion. And I think people look at the elements on the right side of this model, and both on the user side as well as on the vendor side, I think people realize that the money is shifting here. You look at the description on the left side, and I think people equally realize that most of the current money is still here, and nobody quite understands how quickly this migration will occur and how it will actually occur. So I think my favorite element of this slide is the first bullet, because I think it aptly describes the nature of how enterprise IT is changing. And this is the notion that in the traditional world, in the world of systems of record, IT was essentially a railroad builder in our organizations. They laid down tracks. They told us what kinds of locomotives could run on those tracks. They issued our equipment in a standardized fashion. And basically the idea was to carry huge volumes of information from one point to another. And we're in a very different model right now. It's a much more flexible model, much more agile model. It's a lot more like a taxi company, if you will. And so the challenges that that creates on the part of the end user community are really profound. It requires a very different set of technical skills. It requires that technical skills be put in a context in order to help navigate these waters, which are not so much about the plumbing anymore as they are about what flows through the plumbing, the information that flows through the plumbing. And so this element represents an element of extremity moving forward, I think, that is going to be a challenge that we all have to manage. Second is this notion of governance and what that means in an era in which more and more and more information is coming at us in more and more forms and more quickly than ever before. So a couple data points just to think about, this one from Forbes magazine, is that what you have is essentially an overflow of information coming at us at breakneck speed. This data point that 90% of the data in the world was created in the last 2 years. When we think about how we store this and how we sort through what we keep and what we don't keep, I think that's at the core of some of the extreme governance concepts we need to think about moving forward. When you think about this, 40% growth in the volume of information means that 15 petabytes today, whether you keep this in the cloud or whether you keep this on premises or whether you keep it in some hybrid of the two, that's going to be 39 petabytes in 3 years if you don't figure out some way to get rid of the things that you don't want to keep. So if you think about this in terms of a typical large company, and this is a large company issue, this isn't really something that ties to smaller companies. But when you think about a typical large company, they have hundreds or thousands of legal matters, of legal holds, of records classes. They've got thousands and thousands of regulations that they have to comply with. Odds are they have at least 10,000 file shares and SharePoint sites, all sorts of different ECM systems and applications. So the amount of complexity is compounded by the volume of information that we are trying to push through these processes. And this translates into some of the data points in our survey, because I think what organizations are facing is they haven't quite faced up to this complexity of the challenges that extreme governance represent for them. You look at data points like 31% of organizations don't do any information governance training at all. 59% have to deal with multiple jurisdictions. And then the most amazing statistic out of the survey was that in 42% of organizations, the volume of paper, for crying out loud, is still increasing. So a lot of complexity, a lot of volume, a lot of good intentions, and not so faithful implementation against those intentions. And what I think this translates into, if you think about some of the television shows that are out there, it's a hoarder problem that we have in our large organizations in terms of the volume of information. In terms of that dynamic that I mentioned earlier, that 15 petabytes now translates into 39 petabytes 3 years from now. And so when you think about this, I think we have a challenge of thinking through this question much more strategically of disposition management. And the Compliance, Governance, and Oversight Council has done a very, very good job of thinking about this. And so what you have is that on their part, they indicate that as you look at the volume of information, about 5% of what people are collecting is subject to regulatory obligations. 25% is of business value. 2% is subject to legal holds. So that translates into 32% is really what we actually do need to keep. Or in other words, 68% is junk. And so I think that raises all sorts of issues for us. The cost of managing this. I don't think this is the key driver in terms of people looking strategically at extreme governance. This question of litigation cost, bad publicity, loss of IP, all that stuff factors into why I think extreme governance is going to be a key issue for us moving forward. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of extreme action is this concept of extreme engagement. And so I will have a true confession. In preparing for the AIIM conference, we realized that we had to take some on-site payments. And being a systems of engagement guy, I immediately hopped to the question of, gee, why don't we get those cool little square things, pump them into our iPhones and into our iPads, and we'll be able to take payment there, just like is typical in the world of systems of engagement. Then I ran into the systems of record people from my own organization, my finance person, deeply steeped in Great Plains systems of record, my IT guy who is dealing with our own systems of record in terms of our business process that is housed in a company called Aptify. And we came to the conclusion pretty quickly that this was not a bridge that we could pull off very quickly. And I think this gap between systems of record and systems of engagement is characteristic of a lot of processes in our organizations right now. I think as we think about this, Forrester's done some really interesting work that I would refer to you. It's under the title of Smart Process Applications, that talks about how collaboration has really matured to the point that it is a strategically important imperative in our companies. And I think what they say is that it's the combination of forces that have changed the nature of what collaboration is all about, and particularly what the nature of collaboration is all about in the context of business process. So when you look at this and think about this, the vectors that are out there right now, first is mobility, and that basically allows us to collaborate anywhere. You take the whole question of consumerization, and that changes the nature of collaboration because for the first time it can bubble up rather than just be pushed down. You think about this question of big data or analytics, and particularly analytics give us the context in which collaboration from an individual knowledge worker perspective can occur more effectively. And then you take the cloud, and all of a sudden we've bridged the gap between inside and outside the firewall, and we've created a rich stew for collaboration that I think is much, much more than Facebook for Business. It really changed the nature of how we work together, and particularly how we work in the context of business processes. I love this diagram because I think it illustrates the opportunity that we have out there as we start to think about systems of engagement, think about systems of record. It's by an artist named Jan Vorman. And basically the opportunity that's out there is that I think that this rich stew of collaboration out there allows us to think differently about our business processes. Even the most simple business process that we can draw in one of those nice diagrams that looks like it goes seamlessly from one point to another point almost always has gray processes that kick in at different points along the way. And those gray processes tend to be manual, they tend to be collaborative in nature, and they are largely unautomated in our organizations. And I think that is going to change. That is going to be the place in which we're going to start to get real productivity enhancements as this new form of collaboration comes into the organization. I think the second thing we're going to start to see is the ability to take processes, break them apart, break them into smaller pieces, and standardize them. And this will be revolutionary, particularly in terms of the small and mid-sized market, who I think suddenly, with cloud-based standardized processes that cut across verticals and cut across business processes in the organization, will allow the adoption of tools that bridge systems of record and systems of engagement in ways that we never have before. So the last thing, let me turn to this question of Lagniappe and basically what this means in terms of a redefined industry. And I think the question I'd like to pose to you all, to take with you, maybe to think about between now and the next time we get together, is how this industry has gone through stages. They tend to be 10 to 15 years in nature. We had going way back to the roots of AIIM, we had the microfilm era, then the micrographics era, the imaging era, the workflow and document management era, the ECM era. ECM era basically dates to about 2000. And I think we're starting to see the end of that era as a way of talking about this industry and as a way of putting some boundaries around this industry. And the old way, I think, of thinking about content management is that the industry was a collection of discrete technologies. It was ECM, ERM, BPM, capture, taxonomies. And so we viewed content through the prism of discrete technologies. I think the new way of thinking about the industry is it really is a collection of content-intensive applications. And so as you think about that, as you start to think about the industry in a different way, start to think about it through the prism of applications and processes, I think it opens up an entirely new way of thinking about the industry and an entirely new source of opportunity, both for the vendor community as well as the end user community. So thank you so much. It has been a great conference, and we look forward to seeing you next year.